Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Unscripted. Today, we are talking about Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. No, not the recently released live-action film Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the original animated film from 1937, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. With the release of the new live-action Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, I thought it only right we go back in time to talk about the Disney original animated film Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So let's get right into it. It was directed by 6 people: William Cottrell, David Hand, Wilfred Jackson, Larry Morey, Percy Pierce, and Ben Sharpstein, and it was produced by Walt Disney himself. However, Walt Disney was not actually credited with the production of this film. The idea of doing a full-length animated feature film came to Walt in 1933, and in October of 1934, Walt decided on what story he wanted to animate and presented it to his staff. This story he decided on was Snow White. He acted out the entirety of his idea, becoming each and every one of the characters as he acted this out. He truly believed that he and his staff could do it, and they did too. However, before landing on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs for the first full-length animated film, Walt also considered animating 3 other stories: Alice in Wonderland, Cinderella, and Peter Pan. But why did Walt choose Snow White? Well, the answer is simple. Walt remembered seeing a version of it starring Marguerite Clark when he was 15 in 1916. It was one of the first films he ever saw, and he felt Snow White's tale was more practical and thought he could use the dwarves as comic relief, which he felt was necessary for the story's success, or for the film's success. When people found out that Walt was planning on making a full-length feature animated film in color, they thought he was crazy. They thought that the color in the animation would hurt their eyes if it was a full feature film, or that no one would be able to sit through a full-length film, and they thought it would just be a movie full of gags. And while Walt is really good at gags, and that's what all of his shorts had in them, he knew that a movie had to be more than just gags. He knew that a story had to be more than gags. And even his wife and brother were skeptical of this endeavor. Everyone thought it would flop, but Walt didn't let that stop him. After all, he did enjoy doing the impossible. And if anyone can do the impossible, it's Walt Disney. Now, a story can't go anywhere without a little bit of development, and this story development process starts with the artist's mind and their ideas. Then, those ideas are manifest into drawings. The first drawings are concept drawings, or, at Disney, known as inspiration sketches. This step is when artists can let their imagination roam free. They can draw whatever they feel fits the story and move from there. And in the next stage, artists begin to pin down the story using storyboarding. Now, fun fact for you, storyboarding actually originated at the Disney Studios. Storyboarding allows you to see a whole sequence of the story right in front of you. You can see the flow and the character development and make sure things are going the way they need to for the story to move forward and make sense. It is the best phase for ideas to be suggested, embellished, replaced, or sometimes even deleted. Now, a good example of a scene that was deleted is the scene "Someday My Prince Will Come." This scene was supposed to have a dream sequence, but Walt realized he didn't need to interfere with Snow White's storytelling, and that it was more important to get the dwarves' reactions than it was for her to imagine her dream. In short, he realized that this dream sequence just didn't add anything to the story. Now, during production and development, Snow White went through 4 years of rewrites, sketches, and paintings, and the original budget of this film was actually estimated to be around $250,000. Now, keep in mind that's $250,000 in 1937, not $250,000 in today's day. So that's a lot of money back then, and a heck of a lot more money now. But Walt's desire for on-screen perfection completely destroyed the budget that they had set. About 2 million paintings were done by a staff of 750 artists, and by the time of the premiere in December of 1937, costs had gone up to $1.5 million, most of which was actually borrowed. Now, sometime during production, they ran out of money, and this was before the film could be finished, and the funds to finish this film were nowhere to be found. But this was something they kept under wraps. They didn't want everybody to know that they'd run out of money and couldn't finish this film. So they kept it on the down low and continued their work while Walt tried to find a way to get more funds to complete this journey and finish Snow White. So, to get more money for the film, what did Walt do? He put a mortgage on his house, and his brother, Roy, convinced him to go to Joe Rosenberg, an executive at the Bank of America, to get a loan. Walt presented Joe with his project/film, and Joe sat expressionless through the whole presentation. Walt walked him to his car afterwards, and Joe didn't speak a word about the film until he was about to leave. At that point, he told Walt that his film would make him, quote unquote, a hatful of money, and he gave Walt the loan. So now they have the money to finish making the film and essentially make history. This film, we'll get into it later, but this film was a first in so many different ways, and it wouldn't have been possible without that loan. So with the story now developed, we now have to take the characters that we have from this story and develop them and make them fit into this story and make sense in this story. So early designs of the characters actually looked comic, more like the Silly Symphony characters. They were more cartoony and less real than what Walt wanted them to be. One of the challenges of the character design and development was actually making the characters look more realistic. A lot of these artists, they hadn't done realistic art like this before because they'd been working on animated cartoons since they started working with the Disney company. So this project and making it look a little more realistic presented more difficult challenges. So they struggled making it realistic, and Walt didn't want something cute like his Mickey cartoons. He wanted it to look real. And animating lifelike human figures and creating depth in 2D images proved to be a difficult task. To get around the challenge, Walt actually sent his artists to classes at the LA, now, pardon me, I'm probably going to say this wrong, LA Chouinard Art Institute to learn how to draw more lifelike, realistic characters. And this actually led Walt to later on create the Disney Art School. The artists would go work on the film during the day, and then at night they would go to the life drawing classes. And on top of that, Walt would bring live animals into the studio for artists to use as reference, and live action models were also hired to help play out the whole movie for the film. And this is actually a process that is still done today. So what they would do is the live actors, they would act out the whole film, and then the artists would watch what they had filmed, and they would draw everything out frame by frame to create this film. So now that we have a story and we have characters in development, I'm going to take each of the main characters, so Snow White, the prince, the queen, the dwarves. I'm going to take each of our characters and we're going to go a little bit more into the development of them and a little bit of the casting that they went through to get these characters voiced. We'll start with Snow White. The team, they went back and forth between a realistic human form and a cartoon-like form for Snow White. And what they found was a good middle ground when they were playing with the proportions of the character. What they landed on was a character with a larger than normal head, and then from there, they modified her other proportions similarly. And every artist who worked on Snow had his own version of the princess. Real makeup was applied to the cells to give her a rosy complexion, and this was something that was actually brought up by the female artists in the ink and paint department. They noticed that Snow looked a little too flat, and one of the artists took some blush and applied it to the cells on Snow's cheeks to add a little bit more depth and life to Snow White, to make her look a little bit less flat. And it really worked. It worked really well, and that's what they did throughout the entire film. They used real makeup on her face to give her her rosy cheeks, her rosy complexion, make her face pop out a little bit more. It was really a brilliant idea. And Marjorie Belcher, she was 14 at the time. She was the dancer that they hired to be the live-action reference for Snow White. She was paid $10 a day to do this. There was no choreography for her to follow or learn. She just made it up as she went. What they wanted from her was the feelings Snow was feeling and that Snow had when she was dancing with the dwarves. The moves she used are actually the moves that were used in the film. Now, casting for Snow White proved to be a long task based on what I found. And I didn't find a lot, but what I did find was this. The voice of Snow was Adriana Caselotti. She was chosen out of hundreds of girls to be the voice of Snow White. Adriana was the daughter of an LA voice coach. She was 18 years old at the time of casting and voicing Snow White, and she had a very childlike, shrill voice, as you can hear in the movie and the soundtrack. And Walt was actually worried that her singing would irritate the audiences. She was paid $20 a day, and for the last 3 days of her work, she was paid $50 a day. And Walt actually made her sign a contract at one point that prohibited her from taking any roles after Snow White. And Adriana wasn't actually given credit for the role at the time because Walt wanted to keep a bit of a mystery around the character. And not giving her credit provided that mystery for Snow White. Later on, she obviously was given credit for the role. But this contract that she signed actually caused her to turn down an appearance on the Jack Benny show, which could have launched her career if she had been able to go on to this show. She didn't actually hold a grudge for this. She said, quote, "I got to be Snow White. I think I'm living happily ever after," unquote. So she clearly wasn't upset about this. I mean, she got to be Snow White, and Snow White was a first for so many things. And it's a huge opportunity. She was the first Disney princess, and she was the start of everything. So it was, I mean, I'm sure she looked back at it, and it was just this opportunity that she was glad that she got to have at all. And I don't know who wouldn't be excited to have that opportunity and just honored to have the opportunity to be the first Disney princess. So, moving on to the prince, though. The prince was harder to animate, hence only being in 2 scenes in the entire film. He originally had a much larger role, though, from the one he ends up with in the final film. However, due to the difficulty in animating him, his role was greatly reduced. The original plan for the prince was to have him be captured and chained by the queen, only to fight the guards and later escape. And that's all I had on him. He's in a whole, 5 minutes of the film, so there's not a ton on him. The animators, they ran into trouble animating male characters. What they found was female characters were much easier to animate than the male characters were, so they struggled with that for a while, but eventually, as they got more experience in animating, the male characters became easier to animate for them, and we see them more as time goes on in other films. We see more of the male characters making more appearances. Louis Hightower was hired to be the live action model for the prince, and the reasoning behind this was because Walt liked his quote unquote sturdy legs. Harry Stockwell was cast as the voice of the prince. He was an actor and a singer. His voice can be heard only briefly, though, in the film. In I'm Wishing One Star at the start of the film, and in one song at the end of the film. And another thing is, the prince never got a name. However, if you look into it, the Snow White's prince does have quite a few names. A few that I've found were Florian, Ferdinand, in Once Upon a Time, Snow White's prince is named David, and then more recently in the live-action adaptation of Snow White, we don't have a prince, but our male main character, his name is Jonathan, a common thief who replaces the role of the prince, but as you can see, Snow White's prince, or Snow White's true love, I guess, goes through several different names. So as for what his name actually is, I'm not 100% sure. If you do know what the prince's name is, though, go ahead and put it in the comments below. I would love to know what his name actually is. With that, we now move on to the evil queen / the witch. And the queen in the original concept art was quite different from the queen we have in the final product. Notes from a meeting in October of 1934 state that that she was to be tried out as a fat cartoon type that was sort of vain and self-satisfied, a sort of comedy type, as well as a high-collar, stately type. Drawings of the queen started out doughty and frumpy, and slowly they evolved into cold and beautiful. Lucille Laverne was cast as the voice of the witch and Queen Grimhild. Grimhild is the name of the evil queen. We know her as the evil queen, but she does have a name. I was able to find that. Queen Grimhild, aka the evil queen. She was 68 at the time of casting, and many thought she actually sounded too old to be the queen, but she was chosen to be the voice of the evil queen because she knew how to deliver lines. And when voicing the witch, Laverne would actually remove her dentures to achieve her raspy voice. And that's really all I could find on the witch and the queen. We'll move on to the 7 dwarves now, and with the dwarves in this film, Walt decided that the dwarves would have a bigger role than what they had in the Brothers Grimm fairy tale. He wanted each of them to have their own personality that was based off of their name. And with these names, there were many, many, many rejected names for the characters, including but not limited to Flabby, Shifty, Deafy, Thrifty, and Awful, among many, many others. There's a list somewhere in one of my sources in the description that you can find a very long list of all of the names of the dwarves that they went through and rejected. Eventually, though, after 2 years, the names of the dwarves were finalized to be Doc, Sneezy, Happy, Bashful, Sleepy, Grumpy, and Dopey. And thanks to Walt's careful planning, these characters fit perfectly into the film with the rest of the story. They provide comic relief, and they make the audience care more about what happens to Snow because of how deeply they care for her. The voices of the dwarves are as follows. You have Doc, voiced by Ray Atwell, Sneezy, voiced by Billy Gilbert, Happy, voiced by Otis Harlan, Bashful, voiced by Scotty Matraw, Sleepy and Grumpy were voiced by Pinto Colvig, and Dopey was voiced by Eddie Collins. The animators that were working on the dwarves actually grew so attached to the characters that they refused to let other departments work on them. They insisted that they do everything for these characters. And this kind of backed up the animation process, but to them, their characters were more than just lines on a paper. And earlier we talked about the ink and paint department. I wanted to make a quick note here that the Harmonizing Cartoon Studio actually lent their ink and paint department to Walt to help with the project. So that's why there were so many artists on the film. They had two studios working on this film, essentially. And one thing that the Disney Studios is known for is a good gag, especially back then with their shorts. So Walt had this thing he called a $5 a gag, where staff would get paid for gags. If the gag was good, then whoever came up with it would receive $5. A good example of this is when the dwarves, each of them pop up above the bed, and one by one their noses kind of pop up above the bed frame. That's one of the gags that I remember was a part of this $5 a gag thing. And when you're working on an animated film, they work a little bit differently than live action films. So the scoring and the composing and the dialogue, they're all recorded before drawing begins. So animators and musicians, they would work together for months to make sure that everything was perfectly in sync. The music and the film, the dialogue, to make sure that everything lined up perfectly. The composers of this film were Frank Churchill, Edward H. Plume, Paul Smith, and Leigh Harline. There were 25 songs written before Walt settled on the 8 that are actually used in the film. There's one song that I remember is on the soundtrack that was almost in the film, actually. It's in the scene where the dwarves are entertaining Snow, and the original song they were going to use was You're Never Too Old to Be Young. And if you look on Spotify, it's actually in the album for Snow White and the Seven Dwarves. Take a listen to it. It's a pretty good song. But it was replaced by the silly song in the end, and that's what we have in the final product. Walt was actually just as involved with the musicians as he was with the story artists. He knew music was a good storytelling medium. And Snow White was one of the first film musicals, and Walt didn't want the songs to stop the story, but instead to have personality or move the story forward. And along with the scoring, the composition, and the dialogue, you also have sound effects. Jimmy MacDonald was the sound effects artist, and he was in charge of sound effects that would make Snow White sound more realistic. So, for example, the storm at the end, the dwarves falling down the stairs, things like that. The Silly Symphony cartoons were the testing grounds for Disney's new animation techniques and some of the sound effects and effects that you find in Snow White. They were perfected in these Silly Symphony cartoons. So the realistic animation of nature and animals in these, they were perfected in those shorts so that they could be used in Snow White and not have Snow White be the testing grounds for these effects and sounds and stuff. Moving on, they built 3D models and sets to use as design reference and to help achieve realism. And 8 months before the release, animators and artists were actually still experimenting with the final colors of Snow White's dress. And before I move on to the release and the box office and everything, I want to talk about some technology that was developed for this film and actually changed the face of animation. And I am talking about the multiplane camera. And the multiplane camera was developed by William Garrity, and he actually developed it for the Disney Studios. The multiplane camera was a groundbreaking animation technique and technology that they used to help film Snow White, and it helped them to create the illusion of depth and realism by moving multiple layers of cells past the camera at different speeds. The multiplane camera, it's a motion picture camera that they used in traditional animation, and they actually tested it before using it in Snow White. They tested it in a short titled The Old Mill, and that The Old Mill came out the same year as Snow White in 1937, and it actually won an Academy Award for animated short film. The way the multiplane camera works, though, is artists would only have to draw each element once, and then they would take these elements and they'd put them on kind of like shelves on the camera, and then the layers, they would move towards the camera or away from the camera at each of them at different speeds. And this process of movement would create the illusion of depth in the frame or the scene that they were filming. All of the layers are filmed at the same time by the camera because of the way the camera is built. It's kind of like a big tower, and then at the top of it you have the camera facing downwards towards different planes or shelves where you can put the cells or the artworks, and those shelves, they'll move up or down, and the camera will catch the movement and create that illusion of depth for you. And this movement creates a more realistic looking scene. And the multiplane camera could actually even be used for like realistic tracking shots and rotating images, and it could help create special effects for things like flickering lights or moving water. And it made animated films look more realistic, and it helped to establish more believability in the films. It moved animation forward, and it was a great technological advancement, especially for animation and film. There's actually an episode of Disneyland titled Tricks of Our Trade where Walt explains the multi-camera a little bit more in depth than, and I'm sure even better than I do, but it's a fascinating technology that they created to help with the creation and production of Snow White and animated films and shorts that came after it. Moving on, we have the release of the film. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was released to theaters on December 21st, 1937. It opened at Carthay Circle Theater. And when it released, Walt was actually very nervous, though he soon would find out that there was nothing to be nervous for. It brought people to tears during the scene where the dwarves gather around Snow's coffin, and animator Ward Kimball said, quote, "We knew it was a winner there," unquote. The film even received a standing ovation at the end. So this film was so good, it really brought emotion into the audience, and it shocked everybody because everybody thought it was going to flop. They didn't think it was going to be good. They were afraid that a full-length feature animated film wouldn't hold their attention for long enough. The color would hurt their eyes. So it shocked everybody, and it was a great, great success. Snow White was actually Walt's first animated masterpiece, and it became known as the one that started it all. The film provided Walt with the funds to continue making magic and open his studio. So if you really think about it, Snow White really truly is the one that started it all. The Disney company would no longer be around today had Snow White not been a success. The film earned 4 times more than any other film in box office that year. 3.5 million in North America, and by May 1939, 6.5 million was earned in the international box office. It was the most successful movie of its time. And in February 1939, Shirley Temple presented Walt with a special award, a full-size Oscar with 7 miniature Oscar statues. And a couple other awards or nominations that I want to highlight are in 1938, Frank Churchill, Lee Harline, and Paul J. Smith were nominated for the Best Music and Score at the Academy Awards. And in 1977, the film was nominated for a Grammy for Best Recording for Children. Those are the awards I wanted to highlight. There are a couple more. This film has 13 wins and 6 nominations. You can find them on the IMDb awards page for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. For now, we're going to wrap up this episode with the social impact of this film. Walt changed movie making with this film. He changed the industry forever with this film, and he made history with this film in many, many ways. It was the first full-length animated film. It was the first full-length animated film in color, and it was the first immersive experience on DVD in 2001. It introduced new tech which changed the face of animation and helped advance animation further, and it introduced a new field of entertainment as well. You also have the opportunity to meet Snow White in the parks, and sometimes you can even meet Dopey when he is out with her occasionally. Snow White and the dwarves also make appearances in the parades that come through the parks sometimes. Sometimes the Queen is roaming around the parks as well. She often makes appearances, especially during Halloween time in the parks. You'll see her out more often then. There are also a couple attractions in some of the Disney parks that are based off of the Snow White movie as well. Now, along with social impact, now is the time I do have to bring up the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs live-action film. I'm not going to say much about it here. I do plan on making a video talking about it and giving my opinions on it. I did have the chance to see it in theaters not too long ago, so I will talk a little bit more about it in that video. For now, I'm just bringing it up to say this happened, and it's part of what came from the animated film and Disney's drive to make live-action films. I bring it up because we're talking about Snow White, but if you want a more in-depth conversation about it, there will be a video coming out about it very soon. Back to the animated film. This film is timeless. It is a movie that can be shared and viewed with people of all ages, from children to teenagers to grandparents. It's a film that is loved by all, and it made history and changed the face of animation and gave us what we have today in the Disney company. Without Snow White, there would be no Disney, and I stand by that. This film is timeless. So thank you all so much for listening, wherever you're listening. Follow Unscripted on wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can find us on YouTube as well. Don't forget to subscribe to the Unscripted YouTube channel. I not only upload podcast episodes there, but I also upload videos and shorts there as well. So go subscribe there to get more content from us. And again, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next episode.